Welcome to RPG Reanimators, a podcast for GMs where we dissect horror scenarios and offer our experiences and advice to reanimate them at the table. I'm Nathan.
I'm Alex.
I'm Lex.
I'm Holly.
And I'm Richard. So, was I supposed to jump in there? It felt like an appropriate
Absolutely.
pause.
That is
Cool,
absolutely
good.
correct. We have a freshly delivered specimen. All right, well, rather than dissecting a scenario, today we're examining a whole game system called Cthork Borg. To best understand this aberration, we'll discuss the system itself, what makes it unique, and give our best input on how to try running it at your table. As this is an entirely new beast, we've consulted with a resident expert who can best help us understand how to hack this aberration apart and build it back together again for our maniacal whims. Richard Kelly, the creator of Cthork Borg, and many other games.
Hello, everyone. I'm Richard Kelly. Happy to be here consulting with the Reanimators. You can find rather a lot of games by me at kumida1.itch.io. I also, of course, created Cthork Borg, assembled Cthork Borg. Assembled is probably a more correct term for that. And I'm thrilled to be able to talk about the game.
Awesome.
We're very excited to have you here.
Yes,
Welcome.
very much. Yes. Well, let's begin.
So, Richard, I would love to get to know how you got started with tabletop RPGs and what inspired you to become someone who creates tabletop RPG content.
I like inspired. Inspired is a positive framing here. I don't know if inspired is necessarily how I would see it, because I sort of just started doing this compulsively as a kid. I really wanted a video game system as a really young child, but my parents wouldn't let me have one yet, so I just start drawing levels for platformers on paper, and I think a lot of people did this, but
Oh, yeah.
I went from like that to finding out about D&D from my cousins when I was in my early teens, and it just sort of slowly was pulled into the orbit of doing game design.
So instead of inspired, it was more compelled, really.
Yeah. Inspired implies a certain amount of like voluntary choice.
This is the sort of thing that happens when people don't let you play video games. This is a cautionary tale.
That's the takeaway, yes.
You start developing hobbies and meeting people.
Oh,
Ugh.
Yeah.
God.
Hate it.
Parents take note.
But that is quite beautiful, Richard. So you really are compelled to create this tabletop RPG content. And one of the pieces of content is Cthork Borg. So could you tell me a little bit about the system?
Yeah. I like Lovecraftian horror. I like 1920s, like occult mythos type stuff. And I like having a slightly different angle on it. And it doesn't matter to me particularly what that angle is. I picked one specific angle for Cthork Borg, but I like people doing their own interpretation of mythos stuff. I think the purist works are cool. I really enjoyed Robert Bloch, but I'm even happier to see people reinterpreting it through their own lens, and I think that's very much in the spirit of the like collaborative energy that produced the mythos as a whole.
Yeah, I fully agree. And in fact, whenever I first downloaded Cthork Borg, I was already blown out of the water as I loved your A Word Before We Continue page, before even getting into the system itself, acknowledging how, Lovecraft created something neat, at least the one that really picked up and took off, but so many people have done more and better with this same kind of cosmic horror idea, and that it is developed much beyond a shitty racist small guy who is like cold in his attic writing these things. And that spirit of developing more creativity and fostering just new kinds of cosmic horror for these game settings was really, really great.
Oh, thank you. Lovecraft specifically is just sort of a weird phenomenon to me because I think a lot of the value there was just the copyright black hole that allowed people to keep working with the mythos and keep like adding their own stuff to it. His work in turn pulled a lot from like Poe and M.R. James and William Hope Hodgson, and like you can find the threads for stuff way further back than Lovecraft. Like I think he sort of gets over attributed the ownership of the genre. And yeah, I wrote that whole introductory section just as kind of like the bumper of a vehicle. If you run into the bumper and you realize that colliding with that vehicle is not for you, you can back off and go somewhere else.
I noticed that a lot of the works that you do are use that like the Mork Borg system, which I think is delightful and I love very much. I wanted to know what about the system itself kind of drew you to writing systems for it, I guess.
Part of it is that it's very simple. And because it's simple, I can build complexity off of it without worrying about tripping over system elements. I don't think anything I've worked on with Mork Borg has really transformed the system into something else. Like sometimes you'll get development of an engine to the point where it is fully its own game. It has its own principles. It has its own objective. And I don't think I've escaped like the essential nature of Mork Borg at any point. But I also kind of click with that essential nature where it's designed to be a little bit loose and a little bit collaborative, and there are numbers that you can fall back to when you need them. But a lot of the game happens in the conversation between players and GM.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
This feels like a big case of if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Yep.
It's dead simple. There's plenty of room to build and kind of roll with whatever you need at the table. It's something I love about the Mork Borg system is that it wholeheartedly says, here are some kind of baseline rules, but make it up as you go. If something isn't covered, you decide and move on. And it's a way to keep that kind of collaborative storytelling building at the table.
Yeah.
It is a super elegant system. It's basically, for those who aren't familiar with Mork Borg, it's a d20 roll plus an attribute with a target number of 12. And that's it.
Yep.
And I just want to note, you'd think that would mean your players fail 60% of the time-ish. And I've never found that to be the case, and I would like a refund on all Mork Borg systems.
Well, that's because people take advantage of the omens.
Yeah. I was so startled when I finally got Mork Borg to the table for the first time, because I went into it with the expectation of like, oh, players are very disposable, damage numbers are high, damage mitigation is very random. We're gonna churn through characters, and that was not it at all. The omens give you a kind of survivability in Mork Borg systems that I think in some ways is stronger than what you get in something like D&D 5e, which kind of bills itself as being around character progression.
The fool is invincible. I will carry those words to my grave. It was impossible to take down.
Yeah. The fool was a series of design mistakes. I'm very happy with the result, but it is so strong.
Yeah, that's something I really love how the omens are carried out in this system, because to me, in playing through it, it felt so much like luck in Call of Cthulhu, except each one was punchier because, I mean, typically you only have a small handful. So it's like, oh God, I might die from this. I'll use it. Do I really want to pass this? Do I really want to save some in case I want to live? And it felt a lot snappier than just, I have this like a gas tank that, okay, I may spend 10 points, 13 at a time, that this mattered a lot more.
Yeah, and it's the fact that you can use them after your roll to adjust the target number just straight up have a reroll.
Right.
Like, they're super strong.
Yeah, I agree. I've always I love Call of Cthulhu truly, but sometimes it does feel like the luck kind of mitigates any real like fear of consequence, I guess, because it's like, oh, I'll just spin the luck on this, and I like having that ability, right? I do like, okay, I'm going to mitigate this failure, but I also like that you don't have very much of it either, so you really have to decide if you want to use it or not. So
yep, I've tinkered a little bit with changing the amount of omens that are offered, because I think they really do put sort of a difficulty scale on the game. The more omens you have, the pulpier the tone. The fewer omens, the less you can mitigate, the more you have to just accept consequences sometimes.
Yeah, once we've had a few players that run out of omens during the game, and there is that definite, once they're out of omens, then they start getting real worried about everything.
Yes, that is extremely intentional and very necessary to the way that I pace it when I'm GMing. When
Mhm.
you have one or two omens and you know you are an inch away from entering the fear zone, um, I feel like I can GM horror much more effectively because anything that might produce a roll might produce a failure, which might sap an omen, and now there's just much more tension to play with.
Yeah.
And in terms of you using the system to GM horror, I think this leads into a question that I had, because of course I played in Alex's game. I am now learning that Alex is synonymous with pulp. We
Oh
had a
boy.
great time
Valid.
in our run through of it, but I'm really curious how you would describe your tone of Cthork Borg whenever you run it, or maybe the kind of tone that you had in mind. Because to me, maybe it's from the Mork Borg system. It does capture a kind of slightly pulpy edge that just makes for slightly more cinematic fun at the table, but can still lean into horror really quickly because these people can die terribly, as you said. Like, as soon as you're out of omens, game over. Make a new character, which is also super fast to do, so it's not that big of a deal either.
Yep. In terms of how I run horror, a lot of this comes from like the type of horror that I enjoy the most. I like horror with conflicting tones, and I like horror that isn't necessarily super serious.
Hmm.
Uh, like probably an example of the style of horror that I really click with is the movie Dog Soldiers. Um, I
That has been on my watch list for a long time. I'm going to have to watch it now.
It's fun. It's fun, and it has a very contrasting energy. I wouldn't call it a comedy horror, but it has so many comedic beats to
Yeah,
sort
it
of
looks
anchor the
really over
horror.
the top. And like the trailer has the inner world that like
Yep.
it's so 2000s. It felt very fun to have on in the background.
Yeah, it's lovely. And that tends to be closer to the style of horror that I'll do when I'm running Cthork Borg as horror. I want bits of humor and bits of like warmth between characters to contrast the horror with. And I want the horror to be something that kind of builds in the background and like emanates through the scenario rather than just being like a single isolated moment of danger or just being like a single terrifying visual. I want the tension more than I want the scare itself.
Hmm. Would you say there's any other inspirations that you really had in mind whenever you were trying to develop this system or sharing it for others?
Oh goodness. Um, yes, the problem is that like my inspirations are always kind of a muddle of a lot of conflicting stuff that I've just mashed together and turned into a game. Um, some particular works that were kind of lingering with me while I was working on it. There's a novel by David Nichol called Utopia, spelled with an EU. It is a Lovecraftian horror novel specifically focused on the eugenics movement in the 1930s. Um, and it has a focus on the time period and on the pacing that I really wanted to echo in Cthork Borg. Also, there's obviously the OSR influences via Mork Borg. Um,
Oops, I slipped and
and
bought the book.
oh, oh no.
There's a list of touchstones, Lex, in the front of the Cthork Borg book you should check out because you've got a few others there as well.
Oh, this is dangerous.
There might very well be, which means that a Richard Kelly hallmark here, which is me forgetting stuff that's in the book I wrote, has reared its head again. I'd completely forgotten about the touchstone, so I'm gonna look at that real quick.
Yeah, Utopia's on there.
Yep,
Flowers from the Moon and Other Lunacies by the aforementioned Robert Bloch.
yep.
King of Shreds and Tatters. I wonder who that could be.
Yeah, Amanda Downham is, I think, pretty obscure, but I really like her mythos fiction. I haven't read a ton of it, but it takes a much more kind of cosmopolitan and humanized angle, which
Hmm.
conflicts hugely with the purist mindset, but produces a very different vision, and I like that different vision.
Mhm.
Also, the game Stygian, which
Uh-huh.
is extraordinary for turning the mythos into a classic style CRPG. It makes a lot of little mechanics adjustments to get those two things to play well together, and they all produce a very interesting whole.
I'll have to check that out. I that. So you've brought together a lot of like not only books but video games. I don't see a lot of people credit it, but I like that you do because that's good inspiration.
Oh yeah, no, as the child that desperately wanted to play video games, I grew up into an adult that has played a few video games, so they tend to be an influence for me.
You're just throwing it all into the pot and just like mixing it up. I can see the appeal of tabletop RPGs. I personally like to say that instead of a video game having a game engine and like having everything in script and code, like when you're running a tabletop RPG, the game master is the game engine,
Yes.
which is a lot more freedom.
Yeah, I really like the versatility of tabletop, and
Hmm.
that's kind of what made me initially get super interested in it, is like that story isn't restricted by someone else's vision. You can create it at the table.
It's been so funny, actually, that since I've gotten into tabletop RPGs, it's actually kind of hard for me to get into video games a lot of the time because as soon as I like hit the wall or the edge of an area, I'm like, oh, yeah, that's right. I would have kept going personally. And it just like it breaks me out of it just that much.
Nice, nice.
If I were Princess Peach, I would simply not be kidnapped.
I would simply leave.
Yeah, there's that. Because video games are a huge influence for me, a lot of my other design that isn't in like the OSR mindset tends to be a little bit more like mechanically segmented, tends to have a like slightly more limited expectation of play, or tends to try and channel the player into a very specific way of approaching things. Um, that isn't this.
Well, and out of curiosity, do you think that you see this more video game based inspiration coming in how you create these character classes or how you create some of the abilities or talents and things that they do? This is something I like how the character classes, or I tend to think of them as archetypes, as can work for capturing different play styles where you have a couple of fixed talents and then you have the one randomly determined one, or that you can pick one. I'm just curious how you go about more creating these sorts of character classes.
Uh, okay, sort of two questions there. I'm gonna approach them one at a time. The first is that like the video game influence for Stygian specifically, was that your character in Stygian broadly gets worse over time, but they also build specific capabilities in specific areas in which they're resilient. So you've got this push and pull in the progression of the character. And that was something I very much wanted in Cthork Borg. I want you to be able to lose some points of stability, but pick up a point of toughness and learn a new specialty and suffer a debilitating injury that stays with you, that sort of thing. The second question about designing classes. I've been grappling with this specifically today because I'm working on Seven Strangers 3, and my approach to the classes has developed over time. The disadvantage of not doing all of this in one very large book is that I've unfortunately grown slightly as a designer over the multiple supplements, and like figured out more about what I wanted to do with the overall vision and addressed stuff that I thought was missing, and accidentally introduced a lot of power creep to the classes.
I don't know what you're talking about. The Fool is perfectly balanced and ideal in every way.
The Fool is why I decided to fully commit to having a couple of classes that are like identified in the text as changing the game's genre.
Yeah.
Because the Fool just turns it into a screwball comedy. That thing is unkillable, so the horror becomes funny. With class design, I generally want to give the player a couple of buttons that they can push to change what's happening in the current moment, and also a couple of objectives that they can kind of play towards.
Mhm.
The simplest version is X times per resting comfort. You can get a -4 DR on a test. That's a button. The player has access to it. It's a way to interact with their class in a very selective way. The objective is more like when you are standing above someone else, you deal +1 damage with attacks. That creates a situation that the player wants to put themselves in as part of the class. And I guess the other thing that I do with specialties is at least in my more recent stuff, I try to create something that is broadly usable and relatively good. And then I try to create something else that is very niche and not very good and like extremely weird. Because if there's
Mhm.
two things a specialty does, it's less likely to step on the toes of another specialty, and it's more likely to give the player multiple ways to engage with it. I don't know if that fully answered the question. Let me know if I missed anything.
No, it did. Sorry, like I'm just listening. I'm soaking all
Yeah.
of this up
Okay.
as most of my experience with this sort of more narrative character customization is in terms of like free league selecting archetypes, which sort of determine some ideal stat spreads, and then picking a couple of talents or a talent or two as,
Yep.
this really limits that each person has one thing that's unique that they can do. You're talking about give them one thing and then one kind of special, more niche thing. So that way it just gives them some more motivation to try and act a certain way. And then I also thinking of like Savage Worlds where they have the edges system, which I always find fascinating that players can intentionally take debuffs in order to gain other abilities. But that's already sort of like what you described, that's what happens as you continue in Cthork Borg, that you can take some of these hits in order to develop in one way while you're falling apart in another.
Yeah. And actually, sort of in line with that, one of the things that I tried to do with Cthork Borg, and I don't know if I succeeded, was to attempt to avoid funneling players in one particular direction based on their class. Like when you get better, you can pick stuff that's outside of your class, you can grow in different directions. But I also wanted to be careful not to have the system to like, not to have it hyper incentivize doing one thing really well.
Oh, I already take a Hexblade when my pool comes back for another game.
Gotcha.
Multi-class
Okay.
dip. Yeah, yeah. I'd like to talk a little bit since we're talking about the characters. You not only you have their specialties, but everybody has a D6 table of I won't they're all differently named, but they're like background things.
Yep.
The socialite has brushes with the unknown, the crook has unsettling tasks. How do you approach creating those lore hooks? What do you call them?
Yeah, they're functionally lore hooks and they're very optional. Like I don't want to force people to have particularly a randomized background, but even just a background that is picked from a narrow list. I want people to feel comfortable to have whatever lore they want. Um, but the goal with those is to try and sort of anchor the flavor of the class before the player reads the specialties. So they've got a
Oh.
sense of like the character in their head before they're picking the mechanical parts.
Mhm.
I like that. Yeah, because that we've used those in our games of someone will have a task randomly rolled, and then we'll use that as a main kickoff point for something they want to do during the session. And yeah, a thumbs up. I think that is very helpful for short games too.
That's awesome. I'm glad they're working. I haven't actually play tested them very much myself, so that was like
Don't worry, we'll cut that part. It's fine.
Yeah.
We know
No,
everything
no.
that you're doing, completely deliberate. Mastermind.
I
Yeah.
want to stress that a lot of my design process and a lot of like creative work for me as a person is just fumbling my way towards a goal that I don't know what it is yet.
Just throw it at a
And
wall.
then when I get there, obviously it was all deliberate. I knew what I was doing
Mhm.
all along, but
Of
Yeah,
course.
that's pretty accurate for I think everybody anymore.
yeah, that's reaffirming.
So what with the game, you kind of skewed a lot of you won't find Cthulhu in here. You won't find Nyarlathotep, thank goodness. You will find the King in Yellow, which I found interesting. He's by name in there, but
He's
what
everywhere.
yeah, he's everywhere. What led to the not exactly generic you're giving them new names, you're giving them new interpretations. What led to that?
Specifically that I wanted them to be reinterpreted a little bit, and I like when people reinterpret the mythos, and I wanted to, by changing a little bit but leaving the overall shape recognizable, encourage that process.
And
Um,
that's beautiful because you're doing a show, not tell. you're kind of giving the GM permission to reinterpret the mythos. Like, it's a super interesting design choice because like all of these names are in the public domain. You could freely use them, but your decision is very purposeful to allow the GM to do that, and I find that very commendable.
And I don't know about you all, but I fully intend on using the Migo and Nyarlathotep in every game of Cthork Borg that
Completely valid. And this is another of those cases where I didn't know what I was doing until I'd already done it. Like I was kind of just subconsciously designing the gods in a particular way, and then when I looked back at it, oh yeah, that's what I was doing.
Of course.
I wish I'd been a little bit more thorough. I honestly wish I'd swapped out the King in Yellow for something else, something similar.
The King in Amber, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
The tattered guy, the tattered king.
Yeah, Tatterman.
Color royalty, yeah.
Yeah, I like that he's got his own little mechanic in there without spoiling too much since he's not in my game and people don't do that, but you've managed to kind of deal a way around the corruption of the King in Yellow. That's pretty simple.
Yeah, I try to put in a lot of, in keeping with the pulp tone, a lot of ways to sort of push back against the various gods, and a lot of ways to get them to interact with each other. I don't particularly view them as a cohesive whole, a single force that's opposed to humanity. That firstly feels like it centers humanity a little bit too much, but also it's just a more interesting sort of occult political environment if the gods do not get along.
Yeah, and they all have their own like special mechanics that really does well with integrating the flavor. For example, the one you just said about gods not getting along, you've got the cruel old man who I believe hunts down other
Yes.
magic users.
Yep. Yeah, he hates every god other than himself.
Yep.
And
Relatable.
yeah, he's specifically built around that kind of conflict.
How often do your games involve players starting to serve one of these gods? Because there's some big benefits to serving these gods.
Oh yeah, no. During multiple playtests, I've had someone run the complicit. And they have ended up being one of the more fragile characters. Part of it is it really depends on how you conceive of the complicit, and it's very easy to think of like, oh, this is sort of a reedy occultist. He's frail and he's learned and he's got a compelling voice. I'd love to see someone take a complicit in the opposite direction, where this is an action hero servant of a god.
I could see it. Yeah, it's someone serving the cruel old man. They're just Vin Dieseling around.
Yeah.
The complicit macho man. Oh yeah, I'll go and serve you, brother.
Absolutely. Excellent.
One of the other design things I want to talk about before we get further into the setting is the artifacts. And artifacts are something, I love the design of it. I'd love to know where you came up with it. They're an item that progresses as you use it over investigations. So one investigation, it may just be a sick sword cane that, gives you a +1 to something. But as you go further with it, you might find that, oh, the sword cane's corrupting me in some fashion, or yeah, I can't seem to get away from it. And 4 investigations down the line, now you are the sword cane or something like that.
The sword cane's so dope, I can't put it down. It's cursed.
Yep, exactly. So there's 2 very specific pieces to that bit of design. One is Stygian. Again, this is me recommending Stygian. It's really neat in how it approaches things. It has its own artifact system where you can pick up artifacts. You don't know what they are unless you pay to have them appraised, and money is relatively tight. So you can wear them and you get unspecified benefits, but they all also have a criteria that will cause them to backfire on you, and you don't know that criteria until they're appraised. So I very much like the idea of that, like, you can pick up this thing, and the longer you keep it around, the stronger its effect will be. Better hope that effect is mostly good. And at the same time, while I was working on them, bouncing around in my head was One of the Warhammer RTS games, I think Dawn of War 2, had an expansion pack where the premise is you're a group of space marines and you're investigating a planet, and you periodically recover artifacts from that planet, and you can hand them off to your librarian who will tell you the history of the artifact. And sometimes this raises everyone's faith. If it's a good artifact, sometimes it lowers it if it's a bad artifact. And sometimes you can keep investigating the same artifact to learn more about it. You find this one gun, you hand it to the librarian, he says, "Oh yeah, there's like a minor history to this thing. It's pretty cool. It's pretty holy." He hands it back, and you see that you can investigate it again, and you hand it to him again, and it comes back and says, "Oh, actually, this has been involved in some stuff you probably don't want to know about." And he hands back this extremely cursed gun that you see you can investigate again. And then it becomes a game of like, how many times do you show this artifact to the librarian? How deeply do you believe that this is not an intrinsically evil object? And I really wanted that pacing for the artifacts in Cthork Borg.
Yeah, it's really fun. Plus, as a GM, it's nice to have that MacGuffin as well, I don't have to think of a reason for it now. Like, I can attach things onto it as we go on later, too. I can swap out an attribute if it's like, you know what? That telescope, for example, makes a lot of sense to tie into one of the gods. I'll tweak it a little bit, and now as the players are looking into it, it's drawing in more to the story.
Yeah, I strongly recommend that, and I wish I'd thought to specify it in that section. Being able to swap around bits and pieces or change them creates much more suspense. I think they function unusually well by accident as a way of adding color to the downtime between investigations. Because you don't need to worry about what you're going to narrate happening in a player's life if you know that that skeletonized monkey's paw is scurrying around their home stealing their possessions.
That gives me an idea for something I need to add to my.
Oh, nice. Happy to help.
No.
I can see Nathan's
It's a
brain
monkey
cogs
paw.
turning.
Yeah, I think that's one of the great things about the system and the book you've written. Like, once you start thinking about all of this, it sets your mind on fire with ideas.
That's good to hear. Yeah, I like that, like, with Mork Borg and sort of with OSR in general, it feels like the mechanics are constantly asking you, so what else could you do with this? In sort of a leading tone to encourage you to make your own stuff to engage with the game.
Well, how'd you arrive on the writing style that you use for the Cthork Borg games? Because I think a lot of the rest of us, we play a lot of Call of Cthulhu, and you can't crack open one of those books without lines and lines and lines of text on everything. But Cthork Borg has a lot tighter style, it seems like.
A component there is attention span. I do like the sort of more flowery, more purist, slowly lead someone into a realization of horror by presenting a lot of context for them to filter through. But when I GM, I really like to have dense, tight, easily usable, and easily referenceable material. So I tried to build a game that would be easy for me to run.
Yeah, I think that's something I always considered a characteristic hallmark of at least the base Mork Borg system, is that the descriptions for, like, the Winter Queen, if I'm remembering that name right, it's like 2 sentences, but all of the descriptions are so evocative that it sets every gear turning, that I'm like, ooh, I could do that, I could do this. Like, one of my favorite spells that you can cast turns a stone into, I quote, a child-size hunk of burnt meat. That adjective was not necessary in that sentence, but my God, I'm thinking about it now.
Yeah, a little bit of precision flavor does a lot with that style of design.
So let's talk a little bit about the Cthork Borg setting as it is. Why the Jazz Age? Why the 20s, 30s? What led you to that?
Jazz hands.
Jazz hands.
Yes. So originally it was published as a book of Gilded Age horror.
Okay.
And then I realized that my schooling had failed me and that the Gilded Age did not extend into the 1920s. I have since published a game that is Gilded Age, um, totally unrelated to Cthork Borg, so we'll set that aside for now. Um, I think the 1920s occupies an interesting spot in popular consciousness in that we have a very strong concept of what it looked like back then. But it's also really far away. It's 100 years ago. And that creates both the distance necessary to tell stories without feeling like we're personally super anchored to them.
Hmm.
Um, while still retaining like a ton of easily referenceable information about the period that allows people to add those historical details.
And so I have another two-parter comment question on that. Is this is something I find unique in the system because as we play a lot of Call of Cthulhu, I have frequently mentioned that I am typically exhausted with 20s and 30s COC content because it's very been there, done that. But I think the Cthork Borg hits a bit different for me because you have created this layer of separation. It is not the Call of Cthulhu pages and pages and pages absolute historical accuracy and verisimilitude. This is the Jazz Age. It's gloomy. You're smoking cigarettes. There's a gunshot down the alley behind you. What do you do? And so by creating this just more, you're going off of vibes and creating something evocative and building at the table, I'm not worried about historical accuracy. I am not worried whenever FM radio was invented. It's just something that we can hit this sort of vibe and then roll with it. So yeah, it's something that I appreciate in this system specifically. But as someone who is extremely biased towards running things in more contemporary settings, I just wanted to pick your brain a bit about what would you recommend for someone who might want to try to run this system in a maybe 70s grindhouse or 80s, 90s up to a more modern setting.
70s Grindhouse would be really cool, I think. And I suspect you wouldn't have to change very much. The the point where I think the entire tone of a historical game really starts to change is once you've crossed from the 90s into the aughts. Once the proliferation of the internet has fundamentally altered culture and the way that information moves, it becomes necessary to frame, especially supernatural stories, through a very different lens for them to keep any kind of credibility about the supernatural.
I don't know. This may be ripping on American gods, but I'm smelling a new Cthork Borg god for more modern settings with proliferation of internet and technology.
I think the American gods approach works because it creates a consistent mythology that interacts with all of that modernity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like you have to make those kinds of adjustments in order to run something past the 2000s. In terms of more mechanical adaptation, I think a lot of it's pretty easy. I think you generally don't have to change the fundamental equipment. You do have overall more access to convenient technology for the average person, but that stays very concentrated in cities, in some ways, even into the modern day. So the more rural your game is, the more isolated your game is, the less you'll have to alter. And I think this might even be true if you're in an urban space, but you're dealing with a disenfranchised population. If your game fundamentally centers around people who are othered from the system, you'll have an easier time mechanically framing why they have trouble accessing resources.
Yeah, that seems like a pretty key aspect of this. The social status and dollar tracking and whatnot is that seems pretty key for this.
For me, it was my way of anchoring the player characters to the world around them as directly and concretely as I could. In Cthork Borg, whether or not your peers, whether or not society at large likes you, directly affects your income. And I don't think that was intended as like specifically a comment about anything. It was just a way of keeping the players from feeling fully insulated from the
Yeah.
consequences of their actions.
Can you talk a little bit about the do you call them whispered gossip?
Yep, whispered gossip. That was purely a like emergency patch on the game because I realized how easy it was to just go into situations and flamethrow your problems. And so having that influence your income and in a more severe way your living conditions if you pack on enough whispered gossip creates this kind of reciprocal feedback between the system and the player where it at least encourages them to pick their spots rather than just charging in and being a full player character anytime there's danger.
Yeah, that's a good way to combat murder hobos, is to give them a home.
And I don't want to disallow it either because I think that can sometimes be a satisfying play style, not just for the player, but for the group. Having one character who like is heavily armed and lives in a bog and has like no accommodations whatsoever, but is very good at hunting monsters is an interesting character beat.
Is that the new Van Helsing class?
Oh, let me.
Bog Helsing?
Maybe this will be eight strangers this time.
Uh-oh.
So let's really get into people that are looking to run Cthork Borg at this point. How do you start building up a campaign for this?
For me personally, I don't think several steps ahead. I would just pick an adventure and run it, and then see what parts of the adventure the people in the group click with, based on what they're interested in, what they naturally gravitate towards. It doesn't have to be like they state they want to see more of this, but like if there's a particular thing they interact with a lot, build more in that direction. When I GM longer form stuff, I like to build sandboxes, and I like to build sandboxes around factions and objectives so that even if I don't know what the next beat in the story will be, I know what all the major players are doing, and that will usually create the next thing that happens.
And so this is interesting to me because this is also running a bit contra to some other feelings that we've had regarding other games and other systems, where, say, a system like Delta Green tends to be written much more for longer campaign play, with following the same cell for extended operas, but in reality, it turns out to be pretty episodic, and you are just more creating characters who are going to go through hell, then you create some new characters to go through a different hell. And with Cthork Borg, as with most Mork Borg game, or like of the Mork Borg family, the Borgas,
Yeah.
that they seem to be written to curry an image of this more episodic, highly lethal one shot. And I know whenever Nathan first found the system and started running it, that was his intention. He was just like, great, it's a one shot. There's money tracking. I'm not going to worry about it. But then at the end of that session, he found that the players were really interested in continuing on and wanted to backtrack, and that actually, let's start counting money. Because I think that the system has a sort of low threshold to entry. It's easy to make characters. They're evocative and can be fun to be in their shoes. If they die, it's not the end of the world. You can roll someone up really quickly. And because of that, it actually does work a bit better for longer, spontaneous campaign play, where you may start with some adventure or scenario, and then just as you go through it, these characters are fun, so let's take the things that were interesting from that first game and build into something else. So you can sort of create a campaign as you go without needing to worry about planning too terribly much ahead. This wasn't a question so much as just a long, rambling comment.
No, it was a great comment. I like Delta Green, but I agree with your assessment of it that it feels like in practice it's much better at shotgun scenarios, and it struggles with longer form play because of how meat grindery it is. And I wasn't fully sure what kind of game feel Cthork Borg would produce when I was first working on it. So I just did small scenarios, and I've stuck with just doing small scenarios to to create a situation where groups can approach a lot of different pieces of the setting, a lot of different elements in different ways, without having to commit to like, this is the Pathfinder adventure path we are locked in on.
We are running masks. You are doing
Yeah.
masks.
Yeah,
Oh, boy.
Kingmaker, set your schedules for the next 5 years kind of situation.
Hmm.
I resemble that remark.
Yeah, we're looking at that one right now.
I say this as someone who really likes Pathfinder adventure paths. I would not commit to writing something like that unless I was 100% sure of myself.
Yeah, they usually have like authors for every 3 chapters in those adventure paths. That's what Paizo does.
Yeah.
But back to Cthork Borg, it seems like there's a natural conclusion that you wrote in called Cataclysm, and that's in the Miserere Me Dos. I totally
Gesundheit.
destroyed that.
It's
Miserere
French.
me Deus. I
Yeah.
think my Latin is non-existent, so that is purely a guess on my part.
Right.
Um,
That's the one where the world ends should the miseries roll high enough, correct?
yes. Yeah, that is an element that I just fully pulled from regular Mork Borg. Um, and I I feel like it can produce compelling long-term play, probably, but it's also more avant-garde in that it destroys your game over time. So I completely sympathize with groups that don't use it. Part of the advantage of writing everything as supplements is that it allows people to pick and choose which ones they're using. It doesn't fully canonize anything that's not in the core book. I do not mind the miseries not being canon.
They're very helpful though if like I've used a couple of them as we go of just prompts for things that can happen and then build off of them or like little scenes to go with because I don't always know exactly how like the flutist that agenda progressing like I know the faction is there
Yep.
but I don't like maybe I don't exactly have a next step. That's at least something to get the wheels moving.
Yeah, they also create a thing that I've noticed while GMing, an interesting continuity between otherwise unrelated games.
Mm.
If the miseries persist between different groups that you're GMing for, you can end up with a situation in which like one group sees that the fish prices have dropped suddenly and that rations are really cheap, and another group realizes that their setting is overrun with spiders. It creates a more convivial spirit, I think,
Mm.
between the different gaming groups.
Well, yeah, that's interesting because we do like we've been playing these. We have different groups every time, and I think that's pretty true for when we play. Is there's kind of a shared like oh somebody dropped in, somebody came in. It feels like a troop sort of
Yeah.
play. I think it's been referred to. How many games do you usually hit if you were to do like a I hesitate to say campaign because it is a sandbox, but for something you put a button on at the end.
Um, Trying to think about it, I think the longest I've run a sequence of related characters through Cthork Borg
Mhm.
has been like 7 or 8 sessions, maybe. And that wasn't planned in any way as a campaign. It was just scenarios strung together.
Yeah.
And those characters could theoretically come back for another game. So who knows? 7 or 8 sessions might not be the end of it. I have considered, but have yet to find people willing to commit to the bit with me on running Masks or Orient Express with Cthork Borg to see if I can do it on the fly.
Hmm.
That sounds like a fun challenge, actually.
Yeah,
Um,
we've talked about how well Cthork Borg could be used to run some of the more classic Call of Cthulhu scenarios as a sort of pared down, more accessible way. Yeah, that would certainly be an undertaking to do like horror using Cthork. Cthoror on the Orient Express.
yes,
Oh.
There you
Cthork.
go. There's a series for you.
Good idea, actually. I think now that I'm dwelling on it a little bit, the other thing that might be interesting to try is just to see how far the system will stretch. Run Delta Green with it, run Cthulhu LARPs with it, see what causes it to break. I did write the conversion kit, sorry, the conversion kit, with the expectation that it was probably going to be the more D100 stuff that people would want to run with it. But I want to see the sort of the breadth of the system.
Also, on that note, I would be remiss if I did not mention Nathan shot this idea down, but I still think that it is gold to refer to the GM as the Cththeeper.
I feel like I might be getting a visit from some solicitors if I do that.
You mentioned as well that these are kind of supplemented out, right? Is you have the core Cthork Borg, the Cthork Borg.
Oh God, it's
I'm
catching
trying
on.
to get I'm trying to get in on it, but it's very difficult to say. If I'm a new GM coming into this, what would you recommend now as kind of the starter set for the books?
Just the core book.
Yeah.
Actually, no, Mork Borg. Mork Borg, see if you like that style. And then Cthork Borg, just the core book.
Mhm.
From there, I tried to actually arrange them on my itch.io in sort of like order of applicability, where it's core first, and then Rum Runners for the expanded player options, and Seven Strangers for expanded class options, and then the more GM facing stuff like Miserere, Sense and Stability, Simulacrum of the Soul, stuff like that.
And I also want to mention for folks that do want to look at Mork Borg as a base chassis for the system before getting into Cthork Borg, one critique that I have heard is that some folks bounce off of the rad as fuck art style in Mork Borg, but it's a bit too much for them. And I do want to note that if you look up Mork Borg Bare Bones Edition, you can get all of the text that is in the Mork Borg book for free and be able to look at that, see if you dig it, and then go to the Cthork Borg book. The Cthork Borg doesn't have that same kind of splatter punk Johan Noor art style, so that would not be a potential factor for you as a potential buyer.
Yeah. The Bare Bones edition is really good and is really clean layout. I like the Mork Borg layout, but I also understand how like someone's eyes might have an allergic reaction to it. It is a lot.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the nuts and bolts of the differences between Mork Borg and Cthork Borg. What led to the difference in character creation? Because in Mork Borg, you roll, I think, 3d6, and then you reference a table to decide where your modifier hits, right? Between -3 and +3. But Cthork Borg, you have just a different range of rolling, like a D4 -1, a D2 -1, just a flat D4. What led to that change?
Well, so I decided to use Mork Borg as an engine, and then I immediately started pulling the retro clone elements out of it. I don't know why I did that. I do like the sort of the simpler just roll for a number and get that number instead of having to reference a table. I tried to avoid situations with Cthork Borg where I was creating a table that you had to reference for anything. One of the things that I often try to design towards is the speed at which generating information resolves. The fewer times you have to roll the dice, the fewer pages you have to flip, the less you have to consult the rules, the quicker the game will play and the more energy you can focus on the story that you're telling.
That makes complete sense. I like that. It kind of constrains the range a little bit, but you still get that. Like if you roll a 4 on a D4, you still feel really good. But yeah, you don't have to roll quite as much looking it up.
Yep.
Another one is omens. So we've talked a little bit about omens, but to give an overview is these are things that let you re-roll dice, make checks easier, lets you do full damage, which is really what you should save all of them for, is just doing full damage on your attack. Yeah.
Especially if you have a submachine gun.
Avoiding damage too, I think, right, Nathan?
Yeah, or reducing some damage.
Reducing it.
Yeah,
Exactly. So those are like a one-to-one from Mork in terms of what they do, but they refresh a little differently and you get a different amount. Um, what kind of led to the 5 or 6 omens per adventure design?
I like resource tension. I like the idea that you have an amount of a thing and you are making decisions about how to spend it wisely.
Mhm.
Mork Borg is very good at generating omens every time you rest, so you can really control the pace of your adventure unless there's something propelling you forward at an unusual speed. An environment like the 1920s, where the expectation is most days you can probably rest a little bit, um, it felt like that would create too much safety. So I wanted the omens to be something that you'd watch dwindling and you'd be aware that they were not going up again until the story was complete.
I like those a lot of letting people survive to the end as well. That's one of those. I think we've talked about this before. The dirty secret for the game master is you don't want people to die 10 minutes into your adventure. Not really. Like you want danger to be there perhaps, but it's kind of boring if you lose your character every 15 minutes.
Yeah, and that game of chicken is very intrinsic to horror storytelling because if
Hmm.
like the finality of the horror happens, you can't scare someone anymore. You've already crossed that threshold. So I generally want to design in such a way that it maximizes engagement, especially with horror. For me, horror is about choice, like not necessarily good choice, not necessarily pleasant choice, but if it's just things that are happening to you and you don't have any say in the nature of it, it's easy to check out.
Yeah.
In terms of building into this horror and trying to develop something for memorable sessions, I wanted to open with a comment that I really like that you have moved away from the term sanity in like DG and COC because I just find it still has icky connotations and it's something I've
Yep.
tried to move away from as well. I'm a giant Free League Year Zero fan, and so I really like the stress, panic, and then breaking systems to try and capture it that way. But you've used stability, which I do like as a more general bucket term that you can try and call on mid session to hit that same kind of punch that, like, you've seen something terrible, you better roll to see if you can keep it together, or shit's going to hit the fan. I personally I'm grappling with understanding like when and how to do this for maximum effect mid-session and was wondering if you had any comments or advice on how a GM may be able to better deliver on that note.
Okay. So in this case, the intended mechanic is closer to like your character's ability to keep their composure than it is anything else. And like Call of Cthulhu treats sanity as a very like absolute measure of your ability to correctly perceive the reality around you. That's not what stability is meant to be in Cthork Borg at all. It's meant to be how close you are in any given situation to reacting extremely. Um, and so when I was running the enclosed adventure in the core book, Whispers in the Mountains, for one of my groups, the team had managed to get themselves cornered in a cabin with a bunch of critters outside. And the critters weren't coming in, they were just waiting. And the tension of the situation was building and building. And I called for stability tests to see if anyone did anything rash in response to the stress of the situation. That's generally what I use stability for. I think you can also like it's also written into the core book that you use it in sort of a more conventional Call of Cthulhu style way, where if you read a spooky book or you invoke occult forces and like you're taking in information that you're not ready to process yet, that can also provoke a stability roll or affect your overall stability.
And I wonder to try and deliver more important or punchier moments for that, just picking your brain, what would you think of GMs maybe if a player character experiences something particularly horrible? just saying reduce your stability by 1 until maybe the end of this session or some point to recover, and taking a direct penalty to that because it's difficult for them to hold it together, or potentially setting higher difficulty ratings depending on what is going on. Like if they watch a companion get torn apart in front of them, that's not a DR12 to hold it together. That's a DR16 or more to try to hold it together that way.
Yeah, that feels like a much more sort of classic Call of Cthulhu approach to it. And I think that definitely works here. I do particularly like the idea of having temporary stability loss. Especially if you want something more like that classic Call of Cthulhu feeling, where people are getting more stressed out over the course of the investigation. It
exactly. And that's what I love about the year 0 stress system, where it's just, as a GM, I can say, you take a stress, like this is fucked up, take a stress. And it makes it harder for people to hold it together as the tension is building more and more. So it causes things to fall apart dramatically. Yes, Nathan, I live for stress. I am stress.
Yeah, that I definitely like that. And I think you could probably use stress in exactly that way. Just have stress tokens that build up in some circumstances. And they last until the end of the adventure. They penalize your stability rolls. I haven't personally run it that way very much. I've used it a lot more as like a way to propel people into more dangerous scenarios. You're approaching the cabin, you think someone's in there, you've been chased here by cultists, you're concerned about what's going to happen next. Test stability, the player fails the test, and I say, all right, do you become super aggressive or do you shut down? And that choice will put them into one of two different dangerous situations.
Yeah, that's a big one that I have adopted from pretending to be people, that I mostly remember coining the term fight, flight, or freeze that they use in Delta Green. Like when they hit a breaking point, that's my, all right, shit is hitting the fan. What does your character do? And one of these 3 ways that is, less than ideal, but fitting for what the player thinks that they would role play as.
Yeah.
I do like that element of choice. Yeah, like some choice, limited choice, but the choice.
And knowing that they're going to be doing something not tactically wise.
For me, like the fundamental goal is not to take the player agency away if I can avoid doing so. And whether that's in terms of like stun effects, I try to avoid. Having characters die early, I try to avoid it unless it's a choice that they're committing to.
You don't love being stunned and losing your next turn with no fucking save or anything to do about it? I can't believe it. That's peak game design.
Amazing.
Just don't be unlucky. That's it.
I think it can work in games like Darkest Dungeon, for example, specifically because you're controlling multiple characters. It feels awful if they're all stunned. But if a couple are stunned, you're in a bad situation and you're making decisions about managing that situation. So I think if there was a way to do a stun that like temporarily shut down 1 or 2 things that your character could do, but left you with other options, that stun would work fine.
I don't mean to constantly bring up Free League or Year 0, but we've just been running a bunch of Alien, and I think that this is something I really like with that system, where each character has 2, a fast and a slow action to use each round. And that way, if I say you freak out and lose your slow action, that hurts, but you're not just standing there, as you can at least do something fast. And I think that maybe that could be something to try and deliver in this too. If you are going to say flee, great, you sort of can't move or do much else on this turn, but you can get 1 slow action or something like that to try and more narratively work within that scope of still providing some choice on their turn.
Yeah, that's really neat. I like the fast and slow action idea. I still need to read Alien.
I'm planning on running Destroyer of Worlds sometime soon if you're interested.
I am 1000% interested, depending on schedule. Yeah, that would rule.
Hell yeah.
It's so fun.
So you did mention having multiple characters, and we did just play a funnel game in which we had more deaths than characters we initially brought in. Have you ever tried running a funnel like level 0, just 1920s people
Oh my god,
walking into a meat grinder and see what happens?
Oh, did you run a funnel in Cthork?
No, we
No,
ran a funnel with
dungeon
dungeon
crawl
crawl
Ah,
classics.
okay. Yep. DCC is super good. Um, I now have some ideas for a funnel in
Oh, there you
Cthork.
go. We're
That
spitballing here.
uh that would be a really interesting thing to construct a scenario around, but I haven't done that specifically with it yet.
we can make it happen. There's a lot of classes, which is one of my favorite things about Cthork Borg is just the breadth of things you can be. I could see that being a lot of fun of bringing in random characters and being like, it turns out you are a ghoulkin after all of this is through. You go and get something from that class.
Yeah, like you finally remember who you are.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that
Easy.
could be an angle on it. The the problem with the range of classes and the like diversity of class backgrounds is that it then becomes really hard to justify why this situation is producing people of all these different classes.
Yeah.
Oh yes, I remembered just now that I inherited a fortune kind of thing.
I think that that can be something for GMs to deliver based on that character's actions and things. As we have mentioned, that the artifacts can be something of a plot convenient MacGuffin that, you know, you can just have this item. They picked up a brass telescope. Cool. Didn't really think anything of it. You know what? That would be interesting if I did, and then build in something else there. So maybe between sessions, if you're mulling on, you know, that character did a lot of talking with folks, and, you know, even though that they may have been a soldier veteran, they were trying to schmooze things up. So maybe they can take a page from the socialite, and that the GM may be able to dole out some ideas of this may be a way that they could develop based on their actions and performance.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like an effective playable character creation. Let's say you succeed on like a social role and you're
Mm.
more inclined to be a dilettante class or a smoozer, but if you fail that social role, you're more likely to be a grizzled like soldier or an urchin or whatnot.
Yeah, I do like that kind of playable character creation when I've seen
Yeah.
it in like computer RPGs.
Hmm.
Um, I feel like there could even be an angle for like a King in Yellow campaign here,
Hmm.
where your history is sort of bleeding into other histories and parts of your past are not fully fixed anymore.
Impossible Cathanscapes here
Ah,
on
yes,
RPG
yes.
Oh my
Reanimators.
God.
This is causing Holly physical pain,
Yeah,
just so
I'm
people
dying
know.
over here.
Um, so kind of in that idea of the campaign, you've mentioned before that you like to set up sandboxes. Can you talk a little bit about you're coming in fresh, you've got a new batch of players, you've got a new scenario to run them through. What do you do to set up kind of the various factions? How far do you plan on who hates who?
Um, I am notorious for not planning more than a minute ahead, and I have forcibly broken myself of that habit over the course of running
Mhm.
some home campaigns for stuff. Um, in general, I tend to think one or maybe two sessions out. So, based on where the player characters are currently, I'll do
Mhm.
some thinking about what might be operating in that area. And that will be more broadly informed by what has happened previously in the campaign. If they have a lot of like heal heat with a particular cult, then I'll
Yep.
figure out how that cult connects to all of this.
Do you usually bring in all of the cults at, initial, they can go anywhere and run across anybody, or do you try and limit down to a few that they're probably going to run into unless inspiration hits you?
I have done almost nothing with the cults in the games that I've run, except for when a player brings it in.
uh,
A lot of the time, my focus has been on specific situations. Part of the thing with the cults is that like you can see how to get from them to the more like traditional mythos
mhm.
creatures. And so they do still have that feeling of familiarity around them. But if I just drop giant bats in a cabin in the woods, the players aren't expecting that. I'm not even expecting that. And I can do a little
Mhm.
bit more with it as a result of that surprise.
Yeah.
So you said you've been working on your prep. Just to quantify things, what would you say is your improv to prep ratio? Like 80% improv, 20% prep?
Oh, uh, 5% prep, 95% improv,
Hell yeah.
probably. I do for longer campaigns keep a running document so that I can have track of everything, but I do very little like this is what will happen in this following
Mhm.
session, unless it's a piece of the story that's already very much in motion.
This leads into my next question that I guess I'm showing my colors as a very boring Call of Cthulhu, more or less purist, as I really enjoy sort of investigative mystery horrors that may have a complex case that requires layers to pull under, but I at least know the steps of that mystery that I think can lead to a satisfactory payoff for the players. How would you recommend a GM trying to approach something like this using this system? Because Cthork Borg seems to be much more improv based. It's able to, you can build this satisfying story as you're telling it. That's great. But if I wanted to do more, say, if I wanted to do like music from a darkened room in Cthork, where I know sort of everything about the spooky house, but maybe can build here and there, what would you recommend for a different sort of more advanced investigative mystery prep in this system?
Oh, if specifically for mystery and investigation and combat, always plan in advance. That is the exception to my philosophy. If I know that there's going to be a particular monster, I'll always stat it out beforehand. And if I know that there's going to be a mystery, I will always figure out the timeline, the players, and what will happen if it's not addressed.
Mm-hmm.
Because if I'm just if I'm making up the mystery on the fly, it is very easy for me to paint myself into a corner. And if that
100%. I do not think I'm smart enough to like improvise a mystery as we're going. I'm like, it's something. It's out there. Just
yeah,
keep going.
yeah, if I've accidentally improved my way into a compelling hook during a session, the first thing I do after that session ends is sit down and write out where does that lead? What does it connect to? How is it anchored in all the other facts I've introduced so far? Um, Otherwise, I will immediately trip over that hook the second someone asks another question.
Same.
Yeah. In terms of mystery in RPGs, one system that I would like to briefly shout out because it's basically invisible otherwise, and I think it's really good, is Beyond the Fence Below the Grave. It is specifically an OSR, the Dark Ages Norwegian mystery role-playing game. And it constructs itself around that mystery very centrally. Every scenario is a mystery with a list of steps that will occur if the players don't take action. And all of those steps build tension. A secret will get out, someone will kill someone else, there will be repercussions across the community until eventually everything's on fire if the players don't act. And that gives you a series of ways you can poke the players into action while giving them more information about the mystery.
That's cool as hell. And I think
Yeah,
I
that's
can hear
very
Nathan's
interesting.
heart beating faster all the way from here.
Look, it's like Vesson. I'm into it.
Oh yeah, no, I would say it's a lot like Vaesen. It has a
Hell yeah.
similar focus on ritual as a way
Yeah.
to repair the relationship between humans and the otherworldly.
Nice.
So I have a question for you, Richard.
Yeah.
Is there any cut content that you wanted to add originally that didn't make it to any of the books?
I think in a normal and rational design process, you would get that.
Yeah.
In my design process, when I'm working on a book, as soon as I think of something, I throw it in. There are a number of things I haven't been able to do yet, either
Okay.
because I haven't been able to think of a good way to approach them, or I just sort of haven't had the time budget for it. So one of those is a feature-length campaign. I would like to write a Cthork Borg big box campaign. It's just that would
Campaign.
take yes, campaign, a series of scenarios.
Oh my God.
Sorry.
Holly is gonna murder me.
To do something like that, though, I would have to dedicate a huge chunk of time not just to authoring it, but to connecting it in a way that is difficult to disrupt. One of my critiques of stuff like Orient Express is how easy it is for it to fly off the rails, and how hard it is to get back to the intended resolution if that occurs. And so when I'm doing longer form campaign design, my first concern is sort of like the resiliency of the story, because I want players to feel connected to it the whole way through. And I also want to preserve player agency so that they always feel like their choices are valid and will not accidentally remove them from the plot.
Yeah, I would imagine that it would be easier to write this campaign in the style of a sandbox with multiple timers
Yes.
going off at the same time.
Yeah, a sandbox, or even just written as, I think, a faction would sort of work as well.
Yeah, that was my next thought. If you wanted to do, it's something that I always like with Delta Green is your PC motivation is bought and paid for. You are told to do a thing, go do the thing. There is no need to question, what are we even doing here? So having some sort of a faction element in that, I think, could be really helpful, and a source to replenish characters that might meet their end during the trip.
Yeah.
Since we're kind of on this train of like writing for Cthork Borg anyway, I'm sad that I made an unintentional pun.
Join us.
Since we're on this thread anyway, do you have advice for people writing scenarios for Cthork Borg, Richard?
My biggest piece of advice is please write scenarios. I would love to see some third-party stuff for Cthork Borg. There hasn't been any yet, but I would be thrilled if there were any like piece of new character classes or equipment or scenarios or whatever. In terms of writing them, my approach for me personally has been to find an element to center it around and then create a bunch of avenues that people can travel down to reach that element. If that element is a monster, for example, I want to lampshade its location. I want to give people hints about how it functions and what its objectives are. And I want to make the path to encountering it and being scared by it pretty easy to travel down. I unfortunately don't have insights that are any deeper than that when it comes to scenario design, because it's still very much a thing that I'm learning the craft of.
I've read, I think, all of them so far, and I think there's some definite good, you definitely format a lot of them that way, where it's, here's your starting scenario, your players come in, they have to decide what the heck to do with it without defining an end.
Yeah, and I think to that point, having consequences for if the players decide to just leave.
Yeah.
Not as a way of punishing them, but as a way of putting meaning to their actions. Because sometimes just leaving is a good choice and is like dramatically important and a satisfying conclusion.
I mean, yeah, that's Lovecraft's protagonist all the way through, is they get to a point and they say, I'm just going to leave. I'm done.
I would simply leave.
Yes.
I would simply run from the fish people.
Those albino penguins. No, thank you. Good day. I like the improv element of it from the players too, kind of building the campaign. Like as I'm running it too, a little bit of, I'm just asking people each session of like, what did you hear and what do you want to look into? And that's entirely I think I have 3 factions that I've given hints to at some point, and it's just, I don't know coming into the session what people are going to look at, but you know, they'll pick something that they like and tell me, or they'll make something up and go. I really like that the system is easy enough to adapt to that.
Yeah, it actually, to build off of that, it could be interesting to do like a cork board and just
Mm.
pin individual hooks onto it.
I'm sorry,
Sort of
did you say a cork board
yeah,
or
I
a
heard it as soon as I said it.
Cthork
A
board?
Cthork board, if you will.
No, that's a great idea. I like that of that. And it's enough too that like if somebody offers up something new, like Mike has done this a couple times in our games where he'll just say something that's he's like, yes, this is true. There's been a murder at the museum. Okay. I wasn't planning anything with them, but I guess there was. Let's see where that leads.
Yep.
GM, who was it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I genuinely love when players do that. It doesn't feel like it happens super often because there's a fear about stepping on the GM's agency and
Hmm.
interfering, but like I love when people just define truths about their character in a way that intersects with the story. It makes it so much easier to tell that story.
Yeah. And I think it helps too as the GM you just tell people ahead of time like I don't know where this is going. So you guys tell me if you're not running a scenario. Obviously, if you're running any of the published ones, you'd probably be like, "Hey, maybe don't just immediately leave the cabin. Like maybe bite that fish hook this time and see where it goes."
You know, a big part of me is thinking about 10 candles now, and maybe some way
Hmm.
to start a lot of these, you know, already declared a heavily improv session to ask the players to state some things that are true. And that way they can take a piece in building the world. Whenever Alex first ran the one shot for us, he asked us if there were any elements that we would want to include or things that we would like to see in the story. And all of us were kind of like, I'm just here to have fun. Like, I don't have any big preferences, which I didn't mean to shortchange him in terms of inspiration, but maybe asking the players to state one thing around their character, not and strictly involving their character, but about them that is true, could help to build up an interesting session and get those GM wheels turning.
I think this can also intersect with play styles. Because I've definitely seen, and I've definitely also been the type of player who's like, yeah, I don't want to contribute anything to this. I just want to see where it's going. And I think that can be super valid as well. Like, I don't think that's a bad play style. So sometimes I think sometimes it can be good to just sort of take the temperature of the group and say, how much do you want me to tell the story? How much do you want you to tell the story? To what extent am I determining your past versus to what extent are you determining it? And like that ratio can end up being very different for different players. Especially I think for folks that are relatively new, like when I played RPGs for the first time, I was very comforted by all of the rules because it meant I wasn't just playing pretend. There were rules. This was different.
Yeah.
And like that structure can be very reassuring for players who don't like the improv as much.
Hmm.
Or can be confining for players who prefer to do lots of improv and don't necessarily like having to navigate around the harder mechanical bits. That may have been an unhelpful answer on my part. I'm always trying to sort of walk a line between different design styles and different play styles to create space for everyone to sort of express themselves in different ways with the game. Um,
Oh, of course, it's like you said, we're all just spitballing here until we find something that works, and then no, it was all intentional, purely
Yes.
planned.
yes, 100%.
Yeah, I think just thinking about the players in our games of Cthork Borg is they're all pretty enthusiastic about creating their own things, and they'll know if they say, "Yes, I have a grandma that lives here. She's 96." I'll be like, "Yeah, you sure do. Heck yeah, you've got a grandma there." And then I'll be like, "And she also lives next to the factory that you guys are investigating," to try and immediately bring it in. Is if you've got players that like being yes-anded, I think
Not the yes and.
yeah, like the OSR type stuff works really well because you can kind of pivot easier than maybe something where you go, now I have to stat out grandma. And I mean, there's aspects too of, I think, Alex, your backup character was introduced in one of the games as an NPC, and you were just like, that's my character now for
Yep, it's
later.
mine.
I'm saving this for later. And
It's gonna be so tragic, but
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, and I think there's there's a lot of fun to me with this very like light sort of planning where you can just do that pivot and say, sure, here you go. She's yours now. Don't, don't mess it up.
Yep. Yeah, especially with NPCs. They have been a really good way to address unexpected character death because
Mhm.
you can just have the player pivot into the NPC. Um,
On that note, how much combat do you roughly plan for in an adventure where you might lose the character?
I don't plan for any combat. Um, I
Mhm.
create tense situations, and the players always have an option to escalate and respond with violence.
I like it.
I personally find that if I'm designing around like X number of combat encounters per day, that requires a mechanical structure that makes the combat itself very fun to interact with mechanically. And
Mhm.
I've built games like that. I'm working on a game like that, but I don't think Cthork Borg is that game. I think
Yeah.
the tension in Cthork Borg comes from the individual choices, whether that choice is initiating combat, what you do in combat, when you decide to leave, who you prioritize. That's all interesting, but like the D20 plus presence to aim your gun, that's the least interesting part of it all.
I'm glad you also split up the presence roll a bit because in one, I think Rum Runners, you had an example for that, or sense
Uh,
stability, maybe.
Sense and stability, yeah. I realized far too late in design that I had hugely overloaded presence, so I shifted some elements of that over to stability, which is optional because it's in a supplement. By core, sort of do whatever works for you. But it does address a part of the mechanics that hadn't been fully holding its weight.
I'm also finding the like the different maladies or anything thereof. I can see playing this again, like the next campaign. Maybe I'll introduce that or take something else out. I like the toolboxness of it.
Good, good. That's really good to hear.
Kind of in that vein, though, what advice do you have for somebody that's brand new coming in? They're going to run the core rulebook as it is. There's, I think, a page of advice there, but is there anything you want to highlight or add to that?
Brand new to Cthork Borg or brand new to
Yeah.
RPGs?
Let's do Cthork Borg, and then I'm curious, the RPGs one.
Okay. Brand new to Cthork Borg, there is a page of GM advice, and I think I said my stuff more concisely there than I could freestyle right now. Um, the overall approach I would recommend is present the situation to the players, see what the players do, react to the reaction. And by sort of
Hmm.
moving through that sequence, you will continuously produce stuff in the story that happens. For groups that have sort of a lower overall patience, or for groups that prefer like more of like a popcorn style role-playing game, it can be better to cut directly to the action. For example, Whispers in the Mountains has a long lead in where you're doing some preliminary investigation and you're traveling and you're getting a
Yeah.
sense of the community all before anything even remotely scary happens. You can cut through all of that to like you're staying in the cabin and you hear whispers outside. And for a group that is like just looking to play a game on the spot, that might be much more satisfying for them.
Yeah. All right. I think editor note for Lex later. I think we'll skip war stories unless we do that. If you want to see war stories, just watch the YouTube.
Live them.
We're having all
Yeah.
kind of hijinks
Something,
If-
something armored
Um,
wheelchair.
there.
Okay, I saw that and I'm super curious. I know you uploaded a new video, the
boy.
errands for grandpa that I haven't watched yet.
Yes.
Yeah, I ran that one.
Armored wheelchair.
Armored
You can see
wheelchair.
the difference in GMing styles for sure between Nathan and I.
Oh, I'm intrigued. I can't
Yeah.
wait to check this
Using
out.
an elephant gun to unlock the double jump. which
Oh my
is a
God.
hidden feature you didn't even know you included in this system.
Oh, that's amazing. If you've got a couple, you could probably extend it and get some serious airtime. You just
Hell
swap them out
yeah.
on the fly.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Or 2 flamethrowers. Just saying.
Yeah, and we've got a video coming after that is entirely combatless that I ran. So,
Boring. No, I'm
yeah.
kidding.
Oh no, that's not true. Alex almost got punched. So, that's that's something.
So, Richard, do you have any particular method when it comes to coming up with ideas?
Uh, no, no, I do
Stream of
not.
consciousness, just like, bam.
Uh, there are probably three overall paths that ideas take to percolate through my skull. The first is this was given to me in a dream.
Love that.
I've written more than 0 games because I just woke up with a title or an idea and decided to see where that led. I'd say the other fairly common path is I want to make something like something, where I'll try to like Cthork Borg, where I'm looking through a funhouse mirror at the mythos and seeing what that is like in my interpretation of it. And then the third path is I accidentally wrote a game, which has happened several times by this point. I can't control it. I don't know what causes it. Sometimes I'll just sit down and start typing, and then a game will self-assemble.
It's the compulsion.
Mm-hmm.
It's the compulsion, yes.
Not the inspiration, the compulsion.
So you write a lot, and I want to put that out there for folks. If you go to your itch.io, you've got a lot of projects out there. But what's like if you had to pick one to put a cherry on top of to say like, hey, people check this out?
I think that's going to depend hugely on what type of game. Barry, I see. That's going to depend hugely on what type of game that you like. I don't actually have an easy jump from Cthork Borg to any one particular other thing, except. So, you know how I just mentioned that sometimes a game will come to me in a dream, and therefore that game is not my fault. Mendicant Spell Vixens is a game that came to me as a title first. And I had this title and I was like, what do I even do with this? What is this? So I wrote an OSR game about a world of foxes that was post-apocalyptic because they had offended their god, the Great Farmer, by repeatedly stealing chicken. And so now they live in a sort of post-barnyard apocalypse society where the remaining chicken is kept in dungeons and they have to break in and steal it. It is an OSR principled Aesop's Fable cartoon sort of game.
Fever Dream
Fever Dream is a correct description of many things that I write. Fever Dream is correct here. But when I was writing and playtesting it, it probably felt the closest to when I was writing and playtesting Cthork Borg. This is a situation where I'm just going to ask people to trust me on this game. Grab the free version, read through, see how you feel about it.
I have a question for you, Richard, and I need you to be honest.
Go for it.
Are you Grant Howitt?
I wish I had those powers.
We've never seen the two of you in the same room.
This is true.
Smoke bomb.
He has I want to say significantly more artistic skill than me. I've seen like his little illustrations on like the one-page games, and I really like them. Whereas I can do like geometric shapes if I'm using the publisher tool, and then otherwise I'm helpless.
I think I do want to like rep you again. Like I seriously appreciate that you have A, so much content, and B, that some of it is free and just out there for people to enjoy. I think that's I love accessibility for all and things like that, and so I really appreciate it when authors and have that as an available option. So
Oh, everything that I host on my itch.io page should have a community copies button underneath it. So everything should be free. There's a couple of games that I've worked on for other publishers where I'm not publishing it directly, so it's up to them whether to do community copies or how to manage that.
mm.
But when I was coming out of school, I did not have very much money. And so I've been trying to pay that forward with my design, where I always want to make stuff available, so that people who are in that or comparable situations or any situation at all can grab a copy and see if the game's for them.
And for all of the other kids whose parents didn't buy video games, you can provide
Yes.
all of these tabletop RPGs to spread your compulsion to them
Yes,
as well.
if you are someone who shares my deeply tragic backstory, if you have suffered like I have, I'm here for you.
We're so excited to see what you come up with next. So, are you at liberty to tell us about what you're working on next?
Yes. Yes. Do you mean specifically for Cthork Borg or in general?
Anything.
Okay. In general, starting next week, I'm beginning my comprehensive editing pass on Radish Knights, which is a 4E style tactical combat fantasy game about chivalrous vegetables that it funded on Kickstarter, and I'm nearly through with the development side of things. It's almost ready to head over to art and layout. So that'll be coming out soon. I've also got some stuff that I've written for Black Oath. They do games like Caer Nethalas, generally a focus on like solo OSR style, almost like gamebook style RPGs. I've got some material for my Gothic tactical fantasy RPG Overwar that's coming out with them, and I've also done some writing for some of their books. On the Cthork Borg front, I just published Ragged Cuts yesterday, which is a whole bunch of animals and damage mechanics. And I have Seven Strangers 3 in a Google Doc, mostly written, should be ready to go in a week or two.
That's exciting.
That's awesome.
I want to highlight too one of the other non-game necessarily works you've done, the Sprinting Owl Manual for Making TTRPGs. Read through that, and I what led to that, first of all?
Compulsion. The answer there is compulsion. I thought about writing more documentation for the field because there's a lot of really cool, really talented people and groups in the indie, and there's some literature about how to do this, but there isn't a single clear pipeline from like, I want to do design to I have all the resources and knowledge that I need to do this design. I sort of like failed my way forwards in learning all the individual pieces of the craft. And so my hope was that I could maybe pass along some of that and help out some people. I don't know if I succeeded.
If people are looking to do not just system design, but like adventure design, I still think there's it's focused on system, but there's some good things to think about in there that I think you've made really accessible as a workbook. In particular, I want to highlight the threshing the wheat section that talks about feedback. Namely, all feedback is good. Could you talk a little bit about just how people should take feedback?
Oh yeah. So the thing with the all feedback is good is that I've worked for a little bit in like customer service and stuff like that. And that is all feedback is good, the career. No matter what, when someone's giving you feedback, they are providing you information. It's not always the information that they think they're providing, but it is information that you can use to calibrate your approach. So, like, if someone plays your game and comes back really charged, they had an incredibly negative time, and they're certain that this one mechanic is the cause for it, they might be right, but there's also probably several other things that are going on there. One is like They might not be the ideal audience for your game. They might not have been playing it the way you intended for them to play it. There might have been other factors in their group, such as the players or GM, that might have produced an interaction with the mechanic. So there's always data to be gained. It doesn't necessarily mean you always need to make the change that was suggested to you. Also, sometimes the player is 100% right. There have been more than a few situations in playtesting where, like, a player will suggest something. I'll be very reluctant to make the change because it requires me to do work. And the player will be like, no, I think this is very important, and we'll go back and forth for a bit, and then the next day I'll make the change and it'll fix half of the book. So sometimes that's the case too.
Excellent. Yeah, definitely check that out if you're looking into doing writing. Just I think you summarized a lot of really helpful things there. So you've mentioned paying it forward. What are some other RPG authors that you think people should check out?
So I had access to the questions in advance, as everyone here knows, and this is the one I've been like, I'm gonna freeze up when I get this one because everyone is really cool. There are a lot of really good RPGs. Any list that I give here will be extremely non-comprehensive. But if I can point some people towards some stuff, I would like to particularly put a spotlight on Hollow Halls by Rotten Shotgun Games. I also really want to put a spotlight on Thaw.
Is that Thaw? Is in THAW?
Yeah, THAW. It is Thief, Healer, Alchemist, Warrior. I believe it's by Jen Cat Writes, but I don't know what her itch.io handle is. It is a OSR game that is done in the style of MASH, the sleepover game.
Oh.
And it works really well. It meshes those two things perfectly.
As someone who played a lot of MASH as a kid, that sounds delightful.
Strong recommend. It's really cool. And the other game that I mentioned, Hollow Halls, is a fear and hunger style dungeon crawler.
Ooh, brutal.
Where targeting is extremely important because every character is a battleship style grid.
Oh, that makes me think of Mithras.
That's cool.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting read. It's not it does not have the same like aggressive brutality of Fear and Hunger. It takes that back a bit, lands somewhere closer to Berserk, and produces like a very heavy gothic ambience, weird fantasy, like grindhouse RPG. That's sort of the two spectrums of what I can recommend. Thaw and Hollow Halls.
And Thaw
I
is
see
Owl
that-
Night Games on
Owl
itch.io.
Night Games. Yes, thank you.
I will provide as many of these links as I can, although I think I may start hitting character limits in the episode description show notes.
We hope our manic babbling can help you bring this game to life at your table. You can find links to purchase a copy of this system in the show notes of this episode, as well as some actual plays we recommend to see this aberration in action, and an invite to our lab's Discord server.
And everything else we've been talking about tonight.
Oh my goodness, so much, so many links. We also post these episodes and resources to our Patreon. That's free to follow, or if you like, you can make a charitable donation to help us keep the ominously flickering lights on at the H. West Memorial Mortuary and Laboratories. Richard, what's the best way to keep in touch with you?
If you want to follow my designs, you can find me on Blue Sky at sprintingowl.bsky.social. You can also find me on itch.io at kumada1.itch.io. And you can also find me on DriveThruRPG by searching Cthork Borg.
If all else fails, Richard also accepts scrying stones and rabbit howling at a full moon.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm running pretty low on howls, so if anybody wants to send a few this way.
So until next time.
Thanks for listening to RPG Reanimators,
Where your games can die
Or live.
on the table.
Woo!
Ooh. Yeah, I ain't complaining.
Complaining.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
I've done something irrevocable to the English language.
Leaving.